You know, their world changed dramatically that night. On that Thursday evening, almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus' disciples gathered for a meal and for a celebration that they had probably shared together many times before. And they probably did not expect that the next days would be all that different from the days that had come before them. But before that night was over, Jesus would be arrested and they would be scattered in fear. In the next 24 hours, Jesus would be tortured, crucified, dead, and buried. And even though 72 hours from now, some of those disciples at least would claim that they had seen the risen and living Lord, their lives would forever be drastically changed. They'd have to learn how to adapt to a completely new and different world that was about to unfold before them. But even though they didn't know that their world was about to drastically change, on that Thursday night, Jesus began to teach them how to adapt to that new reality that he was calling them to live into, that indeed they were going to need to live into. We call this evening Maundy Thursday, and the name comes from a Latin word, mandatum, which means mandate. And it refers to the mandate, or the commandment of Jesus, to love and to serve one another. In tonight's gospel reading, Jesus actually calls it a new commandment to his disciples. But you know, in fact, it really wasn't a new commandment. The commandment to love one another, to love others as yourself, that's an ancient commandment in the Old Testament. And it was a commandment that Jesus had been teaching and demonstrating to the disciples for years. Instead, tonight, what was new was he was teaching the disciples how to adapt that mandate to a new and changing world. You see, even though they might not have known it at the time, the disciples were going to have to adapt, loving and serving in ways that they had never envisioned before, because their world was about to change. No longer could they just be followers of Jesus and sit around and watch what Jesus did. They couldn't just be helpers, and they couldn't just bask in the glow of the love and the care that Jesus himself gave for others. And so to dramatically demonstrate how they needed to adapt, Jesus began the adaptive process by taking on the role of a servant and washing their feet. This seems really strange to us because washing people's feet isn't something that we usually do in our society. Our feet are generally clean, and our shoes usually protect us from most of the mud and the animal dung that people so often walked through in Jesus' day. But in Jesus' day, washing your feet, or having your servant wash your feet, was a common thing that happened when you came into a house. It just was not common to have the master wash your feet. And it shook the disciples. And see, I think that's what Jesus was after on that night. I think that was what was new about this commandment. It was Jesus' way of shaking up the disciples. He wanted to shake up the disciples enough to consider how they needed to adapt loving and serving and living as his disciples in a new and a different day and age. And that's really what Jesus is still trying to do with us as well. Our world also is changing dramatically around us. And Jesus is calling us to adapt to the changes so that we can be equipped to love and to serve and to be Jesus' disciples in new and different ways. So, in order to shake things up a little bit tonight, we have changed a couple of things in tonight's service. The first is that we've rearranged this worship space to be kind of like the disciples, gathered around the table, facing one another. Interestingly, when the world was about to change for his disciples, Jesus did not tell them to whip themselves into a religious fervor and somehow figure out how to love God more. Instead, he called them to love God by looking at each other and loving each other and serving each other. You know, in every age, Christians have been tempted to separate love of God and love of neighbor, as though somehow the two were separate things that you could pull apart. But perhaps paradoxically, Jesus taught his disciples on that night that if you really want to love God, you need to look at and love and serve your neighbor and find God in the eyes of your neighbor. And then, Jesus did another thing that shook the disciples up. He washed their feet. You know, it was a common act. It was something they did all the time. It's just that they didn't do it for each other. Nobody washed your feet unless it was your slave. It wasn't the master. Now, I don't wash people's feet. You don't wash people's feet. The only time that I've ever done it is on a service like tonight. And somehow or other, that doesn't always connect with what it means to love and to serve, because I don't need my feet so much to serve. But often, I need my hands. And so Pastor Christine and I were thinking tonight, what if we shook things up a little bit? And instead of asking you to wash each other's feet, ask you to wash each other's hands. So we're going to do that a little bit later in the service. And I thought, you know, sometimes when I wash my hands, that really is a way of equipping me to love and to serve others. Because, of course, I wash my hands because I don't want to get sick and have dirt on my hands when I eat, but I thought about a couple of times that I wash my hands because it equips me to serve others. Earlier this week, a lot of you know Larry Spiker, and he's been in the hospital this week with an infection, and so I went to see him and give him a hard time the way I usually do. And when I go into the hospital, regardless of who I'm seeing, I immediately go for those hand washing things, those disinfectant things, and I wash my hands. I don't do it for me, and I do it before I see patients, because that's a way that I can be sure that when I go and see them and talk to them and shake their hand and touch them, that I don't pass on something that maybe their compromised immune system can't deal with. Sometimes washing your hands is a way of serving others. It equips you to serve others. And even if, like me, you have never had kids of your own, you have probably worked with little kids and nieces and nephews and stuff, and you stood at the sink behind them, and you've helped them to wash their hands. You put their hands in your hands and wash them. And you do that not just because you don't want them to get their bloody fingerprints all over your house, but because you want to make sure that they don't get sick, that they don't have something in their hand that might make them ill. You do it to serve. That was the kind of idea Jesus had behind the washing of feet. He wanted people to understand that they needed to be equipped to serve and be his disciples. And maybe, if we wash each other's hands, we'll think about how Jesus is calling us to be people who use our hands to serve and to live, to love, and to be his disciples in new and different ways. You know, our world is changing all around us, and it's often changing really much more quickly and much more dramatically than a lot of us are comfortable with. But you know, it was like that for the first disciples as well. Jesus knew it, and he expected it. And he shook things up for his first disciples so that he could begin the adaptive process of equipping them to love and to serve and to be his disciples in new times and in new ways. That's still what Jesus is doing with us. And so as we journey with Jesus during these next 3 days, let Jesus shape you. Look for the ways in which Jesus is calling you to adapt to the world around you. And expect Jesus to show you new ways and new possibilities to live as his disciples in a new day and age.